Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Design with the Bard. I'm your host, Creepy Bard, and tonight we're going to talk about a problem the gaming industry has had for a while now. A problem with difficulty. Now, you might not think there's a problem. After all, we've been using the same method to set difficulty in games since we started making them, which is itself part of the problem. Until recently, very few people have tried to improve on this, which is a shame because it really needs it, for a lot of reasons that we'll get into in a moment. So, tonight, we're going to explore how Specter Knight, one of the sequels to Shovel Knight, handles assigning difficulty. But before we get into the mechanics, let's have a look at how we've handled difficulty in the past. Since the beginning of variable difficulties, we've used a system that asks you at the beginning of the game, before you've played a single moment of gameplay, how difficult you want the game to be. This seems perfectly fine on the surface, but the longer you think about it, the more flaws become apparent. The first and biggest problem is that it gives no context to the player. Without context, terms like easy, normal, and hard are basically meaningless. Certain games, such as Doom, have tried to mitigate this by adding more difficulty options and attempting to describe each one in relation to other FPS games. While this helps, it ignores the many avenues that games have to display information, and are still meaningless if you haven't played a first-person shooter before. Not to mention, this decision has to be made before you've played the game at all, so you still have no concrete context for what difficulty you would enjoy. Other games have tried to get creative with their difficulty, and this is where we start to see integrated difficulty. Integrated difficulty refers to a difficulty system that is tied to certain game mechanics or features. Dark Souls 2 attempted to do this by leaving in obvious pathing bugs, allowing a ranged character to kite the enemy in strange ways, or even allowing them to snipe certain opponents long before they could actually retaliate, reducing the difficulty for these ranged characters. Super Mario Land 3D tried a much more heavy-handed approach, offering the player the invincibility leaf if they failed over 5 times on a single level, allowing them to take no damage and fly over all of the obstacles. Both of these attempts were in the right spirit, but they ignored the second major problem with the current method. We've created a player base that feels inferior for using the easy mode. By using the traditional naming conventions for so long and so lazily, we've created an idea in players' heads that the easy mode isn't the real way to play the game, and to use easy mode is to admit that you aren't good enough. This problem is a little harder to fix, as it's become systemic in gaming culture. We can mitigate it slightly by simply not calling it easy mode, but it'll take a while before people are willing to let go of this idea. However, Specter Knight may have stumbled on an interesting solution. The Shovel Knight series has had some form of armor mechanic in the game since the beginning, but most of the time this was to create new playstyles. Things like dropping less gold on death did help to ease the punishments of the difficulty a little bit, but it was never a drastic shift. And then Specter Knight was released, and the entire theme for armor shifted. Specter Knight introduced 6 main cloaks, its armor equivalent. The Crimson Cloak, which is the starter cloak and changes gameplay not at all. The Cloak of Clemency, which lets you lose will and darkness instead of dying to pits and spikes, as well as dropping less gold when you do die. The Rail Mail lets you surf on spikes in the floor for a speed boost, assuming that you're quick enough to execute it. The Striker's Shawl, which gives you an extra charge attack. The Raiment of Risk makes no checkpoint runs easier. And finally, the Ghostly Garb, which looks awesome. That's it. However, all of these cloaks serve a difficulty-based purpose. The Cloak of Clemency serves as the game's easy mode, as a very common way for new players to die is to fall off of a cliff or throw themselves into spikes. This adds a few layers of protection to ease the player through some of the more treacherous regions. The normal difficulty is covered by the Crimson Cloak and the Ghostly Garb, which allow the player to play the game with no added or reduced difficulty, but still gives them a goal to work towards, as the Ghostly Garb is the most expensive cloak in the game. The hard difficulty is where things get interesting. Rather than make the game in some arbitrary way more difficult, such as more monsters or fewer health drops, the developers decided to simply add a new mechanic. As such, the Rail Mail adds a surfing mechanic, rewarding players with quick reflexes by letting them use spikes or open terrain to move through the game faster. Meanwhile, the Striker's Shawl rewards more patient players, allowing them to make a well-timed, powerful attack if they can find the right moment. And then Specter Knight takes it one step further, and allows for what we're going to call the expert difficulty. By donning the raiment of risk, the player is rewarded with a little bit of extra darkness and will for smashing checkpoints as they reach them. This incentivizes a way of playing that isn't immediately intuitive to the player. However, the raiment itself is just another hard mode tool, introducing the player to the idea of doing the no checkpoint run with the Crimson or Ghostly Cloak, which is the true expert mode. What's important to remember is that you start the game with the Crimson Cloak, and then have to spend an arbitrary amount of gold to unlock the changes to the difficulty. This creates context for that difficulty, giving players an idea of how the game plays and how they might make it more interesting. Allowing players to choose their difficulty in the middle of gameplay and swap into other difficulties relatively freely is a truly inspired way of handling the difficulty problem. Is the way that Specter Knight handles it perfect? That's hard to say, really. It gives a level of transparency that the other methods of integrated difficulty don't supply, but I would love to see the concept explored more. In the case of Specter Knight, I definitely believe it was the right choice, but other projects may want an approach more specific to their titles. What will be important to remember moving forward is that you want this mechanic to be just subtle enough so that the player recognizes it, but doesn't feel like they're being weak or punished by using it, and Specter Knight does that expertly. I definitely think we'll see more of this type of mechanic in future games, and I'm even excited to see what new forms it could take. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this week's video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and as always, if you want to see more content, then click the link to see whatever YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, and maybe hit us up over on Patreon. Be sure to join us every Saturday for a new video, and every Tuesday we do recordings on Twitch, so be sure to check that out too.